Hi, Misha here, and been kind of doing a fun little video, fun for me, hopefully fun for you, where I pull out a dozen Star Trek ships from the Federation, from Starfleet, of a different category class. For example, did a video on freighters and transports, did one on pure science ships, and now, today, it's one on warships, or as the Federation likes to call them, escort ships, or sometimes tactical cruisers. They really don't like using warship or battleship, but the fact is they have had them and they have needed them. Of course, the Defiant is quite famous, but there are several others, and several others that were hastily kind of refit or built for that role. And really, we don't see much from the Enterprise era, so I don't have any here. We can assume they definitely had some type of warship for the Romulan War, but we've never seen it on screen. And then, of course, for TOS, we didn't see much of anything. So going by kind of chronologically, the first one is the Soyuz class. This is not officially a Miranda or an Avenger, it is a Soyuz. We see it in Season 5, Cause and Effect of Next Generation. And the Bozeman is at least referenced, the USS Bozeman is at least referenced in First Contact. But we don't know if it's the same Bozeman, probably not, but probably a spiritual successor. Anyway, this is obviously a variant on the Miranda hull, and that's okay. And the episode, they say it was from the 2270s, and we know that the Reliant was in service in the 2260s, and this has a slightly higher registry number. It's pretty well the same. It's a little bit longer than a Miranda, at about 243 or so meters, and could be expected to have a crew in the 200 to 250 range. Now, some will tell you that all the sticky out bits that are on these, like here, and mostly on the underside, some will say that those are sensors. Those people are wrong. Even in the real world, the pieces they put on were from a battleship model kit. It is a combat ship, kind of analogous to a Coast Guard cutter, border patrol ship, and so they are phaser cannons. I've said it in many videos, I will stick with it. And that makes a lot of sense because in the 2260s, 2270s, tensions with the Klingons were still very high. Obviously, the Federation would want a dedicated combat ship to patrol borders. But then the Klingons would kind of, there would be a treaty, and the Romulans would kind of go into self-imposed exile, so the Federation kind of loosened up and got back more to exploration and science. Here is the Freedom class, the USS Firebrand as it happens. This is the only on-screen ship outside of the Kelvin timeline to have one warp nacelle. This was classified as a light frigate and escort ship, meaning it was to patrol borders, escort vital convoys, and have rapid response when needed. It was swift and light, and it has a giant honking phaser cannon on the bottom here. Some might tell you that is a sensor. No, that is a phaser cannon. Plus it has phaser strip and it has at least one photon launcher down here. So it was relatively light, had a crew of about 350 to 375, and while not a warship as such, it was analogous to maybe a modern day light cruiser or destroyer. And this was at the Battle of Wolf 359, and it was one of the kit bashes for that graveyard scene. It's kind of a neat one. It's an oversized Galaxy nacelle with a Constitution neck and then a Galaxy saucer. I don't know, it's bizarre, it's weird, I like it, it's neat. It is at least a ship designed to fight things. Likewise, we have the Gnarlins class, the USS Kishu. This was another graveyard scene ship, and it is basically the forerunner of the Galaxy class, where they tested a lot of the technologies to be used on the Galaxy. Construction was ordered around 2330, 2335 for these, and this was one of the key ships used during the Cardassian border wars in the 2350s. Quite a capable ship. It's about 420 meters long, although some sources say 370, and some even say 340. And I've talked about this in other videos about scaling fictional ships. That's why it's almost impossible to do, because the producers don't give a helpful official scale chart usually. Anyway, it had a crew of about 500, maybe 550. The Rutledge that O'Brien served on was said to be one of these. And it has these pods on the top, too. And one more on the bottom under the engineering hull. These are photon torpedo modules. They can fire forward or aft. It's also said that in their place you could have sensor pods, but in this configuration with the 3 photon launchers, it's very clear this is more of a combat variant. And it's one of my favorite ships. It's ships like these that got me to buy the Eagle Moss, because I mean, who does a Gnarlins class? But I think it's neat, it fits right in, and it shows that there was at least some combat thought. Directly leading from that, of course, is the first unofficial official warship of Starfleet, the Defiant class. But even then, on paper, this is categorized as an escort. By the way, the Gnarlins class is categorized officially as a frigate. The Defiant was not there at the Battle of Wolf 359, but that was why it was built. Designed at Utopia Planitia with Cisco, one of the lead project managers. This was really designed as a warship, albeit a defensive one, granted, still a combat ship to fight the Borg. Unfortunately, the Borg came early. I think everyone hates it when people come early. It has very minimal science facilities. It has very little ability to carry extra personnel, transport, no holodecks. It is a warship. Since this was a hero ship in the show, we do know more about it than we normally would. But oddly enough, again, scaling, we don't actually know officially how long it was. Sources range from 100 meters to 150, even more or less. I tend to settle in the 120 to 130 meter range. We do know that it has 4 decks, although one of them seems to be quite small. It has the bridge kind of inset on the top a bit. This front nose section is actually the deflector, which is kind of neat. The nacelles are tucked in. It has a blade of hull armor. It has powerful shielding for its size. It had a crew of around 40 to 50, depending on the mission. And of course it had a whole host of weapons. It had pulse phasers, it had standard beam phasers, and it could fire both photon and quantum torpedoes front and aft, and it was actually very maneuverable and agile, and was a tough little ship, as Riker styled it. But it is definitely, when people think of Federation warships, at the top of the list, because it's the only one that they even at least unofficially acknowledged. The prototype Defiant was first used in 2370, and then they were put into mass production because of first the Klingon, then the Dominion threat, and they were made quite a bit. They were certainly used in a modern sense like a heavily armed destroyer, or maybe a pocket battleship. They definitely punched above their weight class, but were still a small ship. Good thing that the Jem'Hadar also mostly use small ships, and the Klingons mostly use small ships too, huh? It'd be a little awkward if they brought Galaxy Class size ships. But yeah, this is honestly, in the real world, when the writers started kind of going away from the Gene Roddenberry attitude about starships and doing the whole, hey, warships are fun type thing. It's also very similar to the White Star from Babylon 5, at least in the whole concept of being small but overpowered for its size. And it would usher in a whole new generation. But the old ships were there, so they would actually get a fresh coat of paint. One of the prime candidates for kind of weaponization when the first Klingon and Dominion War conflicts got going, of course, was the Nebula class. Again, this is the USS Honju. And this is basically the 24th century version of a Miranda. And it has a module on top. It can be several different things. In the science video, I showed you the Phoenix version with the sensor pod. Well, the Honju here has a weapons pod. And this adds at least one photon torpedo launcher and at least one extra phaser array, but probably much more, plus probably additional power. But either way, this is kind of a Dominion War variant of the Nebula, making it a very capable medium cruiser. Again, there's kind of arguments about size, anything from 440 meters all the way up to over all the way up to over 550. Crew seems to be estimated between 700 and 800. A good warp. I mean, this came into service pretty much concurrently with the Galaxy, and to be honest with you, seems to be a more successful design. Didn't seem to have the glass cannon effect of the Galaxy. Maybe more of a compact design. The warp core is definitely more buried in there, less exposed to attack. I like it. The model has a few issues to do, especially in the rear, but I think it's neat that Eagle Moss gave us 3 different nebula types in the collection, really driving home just how versatile it is. And these are definitely some of the larger warships and more heavily crewed ones that the Federation had during those conflicts. And showing that just because that era was mostly dedicated to peace, that some of the ships couldn't have effect. But it wasn't a fully dedicated warship. Moving on, we have, of course, the Miranda class yet again, and the use of the name Antares yet again. One of the most favorite names in the world for Star Trek writers and people. Usually applied to cargo ships, but this time applied to a Dominion War variant. This does not have the roll bar. Instead, it has another triangular pod, much like the one on the Nebula there, a weapons pod, very most likely, plus two little things here that probably are phaser cannon. And since we see this in a combat setting, it stands to reason that it was being used for just that, combat purposes. We also see plain Mirandas in the Dominion War, but just upgraded nacelles, upgraded engines, and an additional impulse engine. So the hull was still viable. It's about 235 meters long, with a crew of around 200 as usual. I think the reason they kept doing these is they were cheap and reasonably effective, and they pretty much served as destroyers or perhaps light cruisers, but definitely, well, honestly, in the real world, for directing purposes, they served as cannon fodder. But hey, Mirandas are good at that. And one that I like, that it's either a love it or you hate it thing, so basically either you're right or you're wrong. The Jaeger Class. Then it's just called the Jaeger type. Now in the real world, this was a kit bash done for Deep Space Nine, just to give a background ship. They took the saucer section and nacelles from an Intrepid class, and they glued them to the body of a Maquis Raider, sometimes called a Jaeger Class or a Condor Class, and made a warship. In universe, these were said to be done because they had the components and they were cheap and quick to build. They had good impulse power, but not the fastest warp, but not the slowest. They didn't have the heaviest armament. They had at least one phaser cannon, phaser beam array, and photon torpedo. But what they did have was good armor and durable shielding, so they could take a licking. And they were mostly used for either patrol duty, planetary or station, and also used as kind of rapid response replacements for units that had taken a lot of losses in combat. So they were kind of auxiliary units. They were about 400 meters long, with a crew of about 200. Again, they try to make them as efficient as possible. And it is such an ugly mutt that it's cool. No deflector down there, but it doesn't need one because it's got the secondary deflector on the saucer itself. Again, just another background ship, but something in the real world and in universe that would have never been put together except for the needs of the war. So, by definition, a warship. Although, I'm sure they would call it a frigate or light cruiser or something to that effect. Moving on, another one that appeared in the science video, the Saber Class. Funnily enough, the USS Jaeger. Yeah, 2 Jaegers. They really like Chuck. Why wouldn't you? On paper and whatnot, this was officially classified as a science ship, but in reality, we saw it used yet again as an escort and destroyer. It kind of is based on the same principles as the Defiant. It's also been said that this was a competing design to the Defiant, but a little more conservative. Makes sense, because it does have a lot of similarities, but it's a little bit more traditional than the Defiant. It's about 190 meters, has a crew between 40 and 60. It's said to have mostly forward-facing weapons, a small shuttle bay in the back. It is said to have a large number of photon torpedoes for its size, and it'd be quite maneuverable, which we see on screen multiple times, and to have very good sensors, which would make sense for both a science and a combat ship. And these were in mass production by 2370, so just prior to all the major events like the Second Borg incursion and the Klingon uprising and Dominion, and kind of started a new generation of Starfleet ships. But it was definitely designed with combat in mind. It was also designed to be a support craft to help other ships, maybe larger ships, in fleet operations. So it was one of the first Federation ships designed not to just specifically operate alone. You know, you go back to the TOS era, the TMP era, and even the early Next Generation era, and 3 or 4 starships together is considered large, and the Battle of Wolf 359 had 40 ships. But getting into Deep Space Nine, and as ships get smaller, ships are numbered in the dozens, then hundreds, and then over 1,000. So it kind of shows the changing focus, and the fact that honestly the science and exploration part is taking a back seat to what they would feel in the late 24th century. The next ships, the Saber included really, the ships first seen in First Contact, were a new generation. Sometimes their design concepts dated back to the 2350s and the Cardassian border wars, but then after that really didn't go much of anywhere. They were shelved, and then of course the Borg came back, and many were dusted off and put into production. So along with the Saber, the next 3 ships all started to see service between around 2368 and 2370, and would be put into production. And they started to have a more militaristic design ethos. Certainly going away from the kind of hotel in space luxury style of the Galaxy class. These were more Spartan with more kind of stripped down thing. And here is the Norway class, one of my personal little favorites. I just think it's an interesting design. Very flat, very utilitarian, and that's something you'll see with this whole generation, is just kind of having a smaller profile, more streamlined, and more compact in general. This would be classified as a frigate or light cruiser, around the 360-370 meter range, with a crew of around 200. Probably the most interesting design feature of this is instead of phaser strips, it returned to kind of the phaser cannon idea, much like the Defiant or much like the NX from centuries earlier. And it would have 6 to 9 heavy phaser cannons and a modest torpedo. launcher, but this was mostly a gunboat with a focus on phaser. And we saw this in First Contact, and we would have seen it in Deep Space Nine, except in the real world, the CGI model was basically damaged, lost, or incompatible. Either reason, it wasn't really usable for Deep Space Nine, so it was only seen conservatively, but it has appeared in quite a few video games and whatnot, and I don't know, I like it. The model is really nicely done. So that's the gunboat. Next up, we have another design brought out, the Steamrunner class. Very interesting design. Very flat, very boxy. This is said to be for border patrol, and it kind of be used as a police interdictor craft, at least before the wars, which makes sense. The Federation still has to maintain security. To that end, it had facilities to carry troops or other passengers. It had very good phaser coverage, 360 degrees. And while it only had 2 photon torpedo launchers, they actually had oversized capacities, oversized magazines of 200 to 250 torpedoes each, meaning that maybe it couldn't deliver them the fastest, but it could deliver a lot of them, which also meant it was probably designed for long duration missions where it wouldn't get resupplied. And just like with the Norway class, it was about 360, 370 meters with a crew of around 200. Again, they're pretty analogous. And this would not have been the most maneuverable ship. Actually, it's one of the ships that the Saber was designed to specifically complement. This could do the heavy hitting, while the Saber could do the maneuvering and whatnot. To me, it seems like maybe an older design. While it is definitely of the new generation, it just seems a little bit more rustic than the others, but that could just be me. But we did see this quite a bit in the Dominion War. And of course, what video would be complete if you're talking about anything Starfleet without talking about the Akira class, which is the definition of a fan favorite. Definitely the most popular of the 4 background ships from First Contact. It has a bit of a Miranda look to it, but it's decidedly its own thing. This is classified as a medium cruiser, although some say heavy cruiser. Again, there's a little bit of contradiction in the size, but it's around 450 to 500 meters, so getting close on towards some of the larger ships. Likewise, has a larger crew of around 500. It's also faster than the other ones. Not by a huge amount, but yeah, some. And it has a weapons pod in the back that is said to be able to be replaced with a sensor pod for peacetime. Kind of the same old thing. It also has the ability for deep space exploration if the Federation actually ever gets back to that. Some people like to ascribe it with a crazy number. I knew it was going to happen. This one does not like to stand well. Is everything before gravity rudely interrupted me. Some people like to ascribe it with a crazy number of photon torpedo launchers. But it doesn't have that many, but it does have a large number of launchers for its size, but not the 20 or 30 they sometimes say. That would be kind of pointless anyway. It does have an interesting shuttle bay system, a pass-through shuttle bay. It has one large opening in the front and then two smaller ones in the rear, meaning that it can launch and retrieve shuttles or fighters, if it's wartime, at an accelerated rate, which just gives it more flexibility. I actually think that's a neater feature than the idea that it has a bajillion photon launchers. That's just me, though. We see this pass-through bay in a few other ships, for example, the Centaur class, which I nearly put on this list, but didn't. But yeah, so if the Norway is the gunboat, this here is the torpedo boat of the fleet. And it's probably the most successful because it's one of the more versatile designs. So after the war were over, it still had a place in the Starfleet and could be used. And then finally, of course, the Prometheus class. This is one of the few that was exclusive to Voyager. And much like the Defiant, is a truly dedicated warship, although officially it's called a tactical cruiser, and they do give some guff about it being a deep space explorer. I suppose having 4 nacelles would give it some redundancy for that. But no, this is definitely intended to be a warship. It's about 400 meters long. Really don't know the crew. It's pretty highly automated, though. It has regenerative shielding, ablative armor, quantum torpedoes, phasers. It really is the pinnacle of Starfleet warships, and this one was designed not so much in response to the Borg, but the Dominion. Now, its thing in the episode, its gimmick, honestly, was the multi-vector assault mode, where it broke into not 2 parts, but 3, which is maybe cool looking on screen, but from a logistics standpoint is pretty silly, honestly. The whole reason the galaxy separated was to let the saucer go away, taking families and science personnel with it, and also to relieve the star drive of bulk so it could maneuver better and faster. For this one, I'm not sure what advantage having 3 smaller yet weaker targets would be, and even though they could all fire, why not just have 3 different phaser arrays on the same ship? Again, logistically, if you want, just make a flotilla of 3 ships. There's no reason for them to join up. There's no advantage to that. But that's what happens when the writers of a show have very little background in military history, military tactics, or weaponry. That said, I think it's a neat design. Very arrowhead-shaped saucer, very sleek nacelles. And along with the Defiant, it's about the most warshipy warship that Starfleet ever worshipped, because it's pretty much not meant for anything else. But we really don't see it outside of the Season 4 episode, Message in a Bottle from Voyager. We can say that it just wasn't ready for mass production before the end of the Dominion War. On the other hand, we do know it was produced because we see it in Enterprise in the Season 3 future battles, so yeah, why not? So there we have it. A dozen starships from the Federation, either made specifically for combat or retrofit, reconfigured for combat. And they say Starfleet is not a military. You know, kind of need to hope they are, because if not, when you look at pretty much all the other alien races in Star Trek, the ships we've had, from Klingons, Romulans, Dominion, Cardassians, they're all warships. So, yeah, the Federation, the idea of having a peaceful, exploratory science organization is great, but, you know, it's really only great if no one else has big guns. And unfortunately, it seems like everyone they meet does. Now, I will say this. I can think of one other race that doesn't have dedicated warships. The Borg. Seriously, if you think about a cube or a sphere, they're not primarily designed for warfare. They're actually designed to make first contact and to have unique diplomatic relations and welcome people on board and take them onto the ship. They have plenty of extra space, and they'll give you a uniform, and you know, they don't even charge you for all those cybernetic upgrades. It's you know, in a lot of ways, very hospitable of them. Seriously. Another race, the Ferengi, at least early on, they were very combative, but then later it became more commerce. Like I said, there hasn't been much new from Eagle Moss, so just kind of reorganizing in fun little ways, looking at various Federation ships. Why not? And I like the fact that Eagle Moss pretty much did the whole fleet, either be it the Wolf 359 fleet or the Sector 001 fleet or the Dominion War fleet, what have you. Well, if you have any questions or comments, please post them. And which one's your favorite? I don't know. For me, they each kind of have some unique appeal. I really don't know if I could say. I never have been very good at picking favorites. Alrighty, folks. I think I'll let you go. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.